Antiseptic doesn't hide the smell of a dying man. It just layers over it sweet and cloying. Lieutenant Carter thought he owned the trauma bay barking orders at the quiet nurse in the corner. He didn't know her silence wasn't submission. It was the icy calm of a war-zone veteran. Monitors chirped in a jagged, unsyncopated rhythm that Nora found entirely useless. Real dying had a different sound, a wet, rattling silence that machines couldn't quite capture. Here in Trauma Bay 3, the noise was manufactured panic. Alarms beeped for low batteries. Alarms beeped for loose leads. Nobody was actually dying yet, but Lieutenant Bradley Carter was acting like they were. Carter paced the cramped space, adjusting his pristine scrubs. He smelled of expensive cedar cologne and fresh laundry detergent. A severe contrast to the sharp tang of iodine old sweat and gastric acid permanently baked into the room's floor grout. Nora stood near the supply cart, counting out large-bore IVs with mechanical precision. She didn't look up when Carter snapped his fingers. "Hey, you, nurse." His voice cracked slightly, a dead giveaway of the adrenaline spiking in his chest. "We have a multi-system trauma coming in 2 minutes. I need the rapid infuser primed, now!" Nora slid a plastic wrapper back into the drawer. The cellophane crinkled sharply in the quiet bay. "Already primed, Doctor." "Lieutenant," Carter corrected, stiffening his spine. "I'm a lieutenant. I expect military bearing in this bay, especially from civilian staff. We're running this on my protocols." Nora blinked. The urge to laugh tasted like old pennies in her mouth, but she swallowed it down. Military bearing. He looked about 28, fresh out of the Uniformed Services University, dropped into a San Diego Level 1 trauma center to get his reps in before a cushy deployment to a naval carrier. His hands were clean. Too clean. The cuticles were flawless, unbitten. "Understood," she murmured, her voice flat. She didn't offer her name. He hadn't asked. To him, she was just a pair of hands in faded blue scrubs, blending into the background of a busy Tuesday night. She hated civilian hospitals. The whining, the bureaucracy, the sterile safety of it all. But she loved the quiet moments. The times when nobody was shooting at her, when the walls weren't vibrating from artillery fire. It was a bizarre, internal contradiction, craving the raw adrenaline of the sandbox, while simultaneously wanting nothing more than to scrub dried iodine off a linoleum floor in complete silence. A siren wailed outside, cutting through the thick glass of the ambulance bay doors. The radio at the nurse's station squawked. A bad wreck on the interstate. Paramedics were bringing in a John Doe crushed chest, unstable pelvis dropping pressures. Carter rubbed his hands together. "All right, listen up. When he comes through those doors, I want silence. I want ABCs. I want a pan scan ordered before he even hits the bed." He pointed a manicured finger at Nora. "You, stay out of the way. Hand me what I ask for. Don't anticipate. Just obey. I've trained for high-stress scenarios. You haven't." Nora felt a dull throb behind her left eye. A phantom ache from Kandahar. Or maybe Fallujah. They blended together these days into a single memory of coarse sand diesel exhaust and the copper stench of arterial spray. She stared at Carter's finger. It was trembling, just a millimeter vibrating like a plucked guitar string. He was terrified. "Got it," she said. Short, punchy. Give the boy his illusion of control. The double doors crashed open. The paramedics rolled in chests, heaving, shouting vitals over the clatter of the gurney wheels. The smell hit first hot asphalt, ruptured bowels, and the heavy, sweet reek of torn muscle. "John Doe T-boned by a semi," the lead medic yelled, transferring the backboard to the hospital bed with a heavy thud that shook the monitors. "Systolic 60, heart rate 140. We couldn't get a line in the rig. He's bleeding out into his belly." Carter froze. It was only a second, maybe 2, but in trauma, 2 seconds was an eternity. Nora watched his eyes dilate. The textbook algorithms in his head crashed against the messy, wet reality of a crushed human body. The patient was thrashing, coughing up bright pink froth. Tension pneumothorax. His chest was expanding unevenly, the left side inflating while the right remained flat. "Lieutenant," Nora said quietly. Not a question. A prompt. "Right. Carter stepped forward, his voice losing its authoritative bark. Get an 18 gauge in his AC. Someone page surgery." Nora was already moving. She ignored the antecubital space. The veins were flat, useless under the pale, clammy skin. She grabbed an intraosseous drill from the trauma cart. "I said an IV," Carter yelled, his voice shrill, cutting through the groans of the patient. "What are you doing? Put that away." Nora placed the needle against the patient's proximal tibia. She pulled the trigger. The drill buzzed a harsh, grinding noise that vibrated up her arm. The distinct metallic smell of the battery-operated drill mixed with the scent of split skin. It took 3 seconds to hit the marrow cavity. A sudden loss of resistance, a quick flush of saline, and it was secure. "IO is in," she stated, ignoring Carter entirely. Pushing tranexamic acid and hanging uncross-matched blood. Carter shoved past her, his shoulder clipping hers, nearly knocking over the metal Mayo stand. Tools clattered loudly. "You do not touch the patient without my direct order. I am the physician in charge." Nora locked eyes with him over the patient's thrashing chest. Her gaze was completely devoid of emotion. No anger, no defiance, just an empty, terrifying stillness that sucked the air out of the room. "His trachea is deviated, Lieutenant," she said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying underneath the shouting of the medics. "He's tensioning. You need to decompress his chest, right now, or he dies in 40 seconds. Carter looked down. The man's neck was swollen, the windpipe pushed visibly to the right. Panic flared in the lieutenant's face. He fumbled for a large decompression needle from the tray. His hand shook so badly he dropped the plastic casing on the floor. It rolled away under the bed. I can't find the landmark." Carter stammered, the arrogant military officer facade crumbling into dust. The room was too loud. The overhead lights were too bright. The patient was slipping away. Nora stepped closer. She didn't take the needle from him. She wasn't going to save his ego by doing his job. He needed to act. But she wasn't going to let the man on the table die because a junior officer was choking. Second intercostal space. Mid-clavicular line. She instructed, her tone suddenly shifting. It was the voice of a drill instructor mixed with a tired, impatient mother. "Feel the collarbone. Slide down, right there. Push hard." Carter followed her voice blindly. He pressed his fingers against the bruised skin, found the gap between the ribs, and shoved the needle in. A sharp hiss of trapped air escaped, smelling horribly of stale beer and internal bleeding. The patient's heart rate monitor instantly stabilized, dropping from the chaotic 140s down to a steady 110. The oxygen saturation numbers climbed from a dismal 70% to 92. Carter slumped back against the counter, sweat beading on his forehead, ruining his perfect hair. He looked at Nora, his chest heaving. He expected her to gloat. He expected a reprimand or a smug smile. She just turned away, her face impassive. "Blood is infusing. Surgery is 5 minutes out. You need to prep for a central line, Lieutenant. Get your gloves." 40 minutes later, the bay was empty. The floor was smeared with rusty, half-dried footprints, the only evidence of the chaos that had just left for the operating room. Nora grabbed a bleach wipe. The acrid chemical smell burned her nostrils, erasing the lingering odor of the patient. She scrubbed the metal rails of the bed. Her movements were rhythmic, automatic. Cleaning was grounding. It kept her mind from drifting back to Helmand Province, where the dust never really washed out of the floorboards, no matter how hard they scrubbed. Carter stood by the sink, washing his hands with scalding hot water and harsh pink soap. He scrubbed until his knuckles were red and raw. He was furious, not at the situation, at himself, and by extension at her. His inadequacy was a bitter pill, and his pride refused to swallow it. "You undermined me," he said to the mirror, not turning around. The water shut off with a squeak. Nora tossed the dirty wipe into the biohazard bin. It landed with a soft, wet slap. "I established access when peripheral veins were collapsed. It's standard trauma protocol." "It wasn't my protocol." Carter ripped a paper towel from the dispenser. "You bypassed the chain of command. You acted like you were running the room. I don't care how long you've been working at this hospital, nurse. You do not dictate trauma care to a military officer." Nora sighed. A quiet, exhausted sound. She leaned against the supply cart, crossing her arms over her chest. The faded fabric of her scrubs bunched at the shoulders. He was coding Carter. "Lieutenant Carter." He snapped, finally spinning around. His face was flushed, blotchy with anger. "And I had it under control. You dropped the dart. Your hands were shaking." Nora didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The truth hung in the air between them, heavy and immovable. Carter marched past her, his jaw set so tightly a muscle ticked in his cheek. "I'm writing you up. Insubordination. Acting outside your scope of practice. We'll see how smug you are when you're answering to the medical director." He stormed out of the bay. Nora stayed behind, listening to the squeal of his expensive clogs fading down the corridor. She rubbed the back of her neck. Her muscles were tight, pulling at old scar tissue buried under her collarbone. Shrapnel from a mortar round in 2018. It always ached when she had to deal with inflated egos. Up at the main desk, the ER hummed with its usual low-level misery. Drunks snoring in the hallway. A toddler screaming with an ear infection. The faint metallic rattle of a janitor's cart. Carter bypassed all of it, beelining for the glass-walled office of the ER medical director. Dr. Thomas Mitchell was a large man with a permanent scowl, a graying beard, and a coffee cup grafted to his hand. He didn't look up from his dual monitors when Carter shoved the door open. "We have a problem with your nursing staff." Carter began planting both hands flat on Mitchell's desk, trying to project authority. Mitchell took a slow sip of his coffee. He grimaced. Cold. "Good evening to you too, Lieutenant. What's the crisis?" "The nurse in Bay 3, Nora. She's insubordinate. She initiated invasive procedures without orders, talked over me, and completely disregarded the chain of command during a critical resuscitation. She's a liability to this department." Mitchell finally looked up. He pushed his reading glasses down the bridge of his nose, scrutinizing the younger man. "Nora, yes, short brown hair, an attitude problem." Carter stood taller, puffing out his chest. "I demand a formal reprimand. If this were my unit, she'd be facing an Article 15. I won't have civilian staff disrespecting the uniform or compromising patient care." Mitchell stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment. The only sound in the office was the dull whir of the computer tower under the desk and the faint ticking of a wall clock. Then, very slowly, Mitchell leaned back in his leather chair. It groaned under his weight. He didn't look angry. He looked vaguely amused, a reaction that infuriated Carter even more. "Lieutenant," Mitchell said, his voice grating like sandpaper. "Where did you do your tactical medical training?" Carter frowned, thrown off by the question. "Bethesda. Then a specialized combat trauma course at Camp Pendleton before starting this rotation. I graduated top of my class." "Top of your class," Mitchell repeated dryly. "Impressive. Did they teach you about the Joint Special Operations Command's forward surgical teams?" "Of course. JSO CFSTs. They deploy directly with Tier 1 operators to provide immediate surgical stabilization. What does that have to do with an insubordinate civilian nurse?" Mitchell opened his bottom drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder. He tossed it onto the desk. It landed with a heavy, definitive thwack. That civilian nurse didn't just work with JSOC, Lieutenant. She ran the primary trauma stabilization unit for SEAL Team 6 during 3 consecutive deployments in Syria and Afghanistan. Carter froze. The air in the cramped office suddenly felt very thin. "What?" "Captain Nora Hayes," the director said, pointing a thick finger at the file. "Navy Nurse Corps, Silver Star recipient. She commanded the Ghost Ward, a mobile trauma unit that set up 10 miles from high-value targets. She's done open-chest massages in the back of Black Hawks taking active RPG fire. She's operated by flashlight in caves that smelled like cordite and rotting flesh." Carter stared at the folder. The name on the tab stared back at him. He looked from the file to the director, his mouth suddenly dry. "Wait, she's a captain. She retired her commission 2 years ago after catching a piece of a mortar shell in her chest." Mitchell replied, his face hardening into stone. "She works here because she likes the quiet, and because she misses the work." Carter felt a cold sweat prickle at the base of his neck. The memory of his trembling hands in the trauma bay rushed back, playing on a loop in his mind. He had barked at her. He had told her she hadn't trained for high-stress scenarios. He had ordered her to stay out of the way. She didn't say anything." Carter whispered, his previous arrogance evaporating entirely, leaving behind a hollow shell of embarrassment. "No, she wouldn't," Mitchell said, picking his coffee back up. "She doesn't care about rank, Lieutenant. She cares about keeping people breathing. Now you said something about writing her up." Carter looked at the floor. The linoleum suddenly seemed incredibly fascinating. His stomach churned a sour mix of cheap hospital coffee and profound humiliation. The polished facade of the military officer dissolved. He had tried to assert dominance over a woman who had seen more blood, more death, and more pure hell than he would likely encounter in his entire medical career. "No," Carter said, his voice hollow, stripping away all the brass and bravado. I must have misunderstood the situation." "That's what I thought," Mitchell muttered, turning back to his glowing monitors. "Shut the door on your way out." Footsteps sounded too loud in the empty hallway. Carter walked back towards the ER, his stomach churning with an acidic mix of burnt coffee and profound shame. He stopped by the vending machines, resting his forehead against the cool, vibrating glass. A half-empty bag of pretzels stared back at him. He needed to apologize. The thought tasted like bile. He wasn't used to being wrong. He was the golden boy. Med school honors, perfect boards, the pristine uniform. But Mitchell's words echoed relentlessly in his skull. 3 deployments. SEAL Team 6. Silver Star. He found Nora in the staff break room. The space smelled of microwaved fish from 3 shifts ago and cheap lemon floor cleaner. She sat at a sticky laminate table peeling a bruised orange. Her thumbnail broke the rind, releasing a sharp, bright burst of citrus into the stale air. She peeled it methodically, pulling the white pith away in long, unbroken strips. Carter lingered in the doorway. His collar felt 2 sizes too small. "Captain." Nora didn't stop peeling. "Civilian. Or nurse. Take your pick, Lieutenant." "Dr. Mitchell told me." Carter stepped inside, letting the heavy fire door click shut behind him. He stood rigid, his feet shoulder-width apart, hands clasped behind his back, in parade rest, a reflex he couldn't suppress. "About your service. Your deployments. I was out of line. I apologize for disrespecting your rank and your experience." Nora looked up. Her eyes were a flat, unreadable hazel. She dropped a strip of orange peel onto a paper napkin. "You're apologizing for the wrong thing." Carter blinked, thrown off balance. "Excuse me. I don't care about the rank, Carter." She split the orange in half. The wet, tearing sound was loud in the quiet room. "I gave the military 10 years of my life. I left the title behind when I caught shrapnel. What I care about is that you froze, and instead of asking for help, you used your bars to cover up your panic." Carter felt a hot flush creep up his neck, prickly and uncomfortable. "I didn't panic. It was a chaotic environment. It was Tuesday." Nora interrupted, popping a segment of orange into her mouth. She chewed, swallowed, and leaned forward. The fatigue in her face was sudden and stark, carving deep shadows under her cheekbones. "You're terrified of failing. I get it. You think because you have a shiny new MD and a set of tracks on your collar, you're supposed to be infallible. But trauma doesn't care about your GPA. It doesn't care about your textbook algorithms when a man's chest is filling with air. When you freeze, people die." Carter opened his mouth to defend himself, to cite his training, his pedigree, the pressure of command. But the words died in his throat. He looked at her hands resting on the table. They were steady, scarred, competent, hands that had held together shredded arteries in the dark, while mortars rained down. "How do you do it?" He asked, the question slipping out before his pride could build a wall against it. "How do you just turn off the fear?" Nora picked up another piece of orange. "You don't. You just realize the fear is irrelevant. The patient is the only thing that matters in that room. Not your ego, not your rank, not your fear. Just the meat, the mechanics, and the clock." She stood up, tossing the leftover peels into the trash can. She grabbed her stethoscope from the back of a plastic chair and slung it around her neck. "Shift's not over, Lieutenant. Go wash your face. We have 4 more hours." 4 a.m. hit the ER like a physical blow. It was the hour when human bodies naturally wanted to shut down, when the overhead lights hummed a pitch higher, and the smell of stale sickness seemed to settle permanently into the pores of the staff. Carter sat at the charting station, rubbing his gritty eyes. He had spent the last 3 hours suturing minor lacerations and prescribing antibiotics. Quiet work. Safe work. Nora was 2 bays down, restocking the linen carts. They hadn't spoken since the break room. The automatic ambulance bay doors slid open with a rattling wheeze. A young man stumbled in, clutching his left side. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't crying. He just leaned heavily against the triage desk, his breath hitching in short, shallow bursts. He wore a heavy denim jacket, dark and damp near the rib cage. Got mugged." The kid mumbled, his head rolling back slightly. "Think he stabbed me. Just a poke." Carter was up instantly. He beat the triage nurse to the desk, sliding an arm under the kid's shoulders. "Let's get him to Bay 1. Now." Nora was already pulling the curtain back and lowering the bed rails by the time Carter guided the patient into the room. They hoisted him onto the mattress. The kid groaned, his lips pale, a sheen of cold moisture breaking out on his forehead. "Scissors," Carter said. Nora handed them over. The metal was heavy and cold. Carter sheared through the thick denim and the cotton t-shirt beneath. The smell of fresh, iron-heavy blood hit the air, entirely different from the stale odors of the waiting room. It was sharp, urgent. A single puncture wound sat just below the left rib cage. It was small, less than an inch wide, barely bleeding externally. "Looks superficial," Carter murmured, tracing the edge of the wound with a gloved finger. "Vitals. Heart rate is 95. Pressure is 110/70. Nora read from the monitor. "He's compensating." Carter nodded, feeling a rush of relief. A simple laceration. Clean it, pack it, maybe a quick stitch, and observe. "All right, let's get a basic metabolic panel, CBC, and prep a suture tray. I'll irrigate, Lieutenant." The single word stopped him cold. Nora's voice was low, devoid of panic, but laced with a heavy gravitational pull. It was the exact same tone she had used before the car crash victim nearly died hours ago. Carter looked at her. He didn't snap. He didn't pull rank. He just waited. Nora's eyes were fixed on the patient's abdomen. She placed her bare hand flat against the kid's stomach just below the stab wound. She pressed gently. The patient let out a sharp, breathless gasp, his knees trying to curl upward in an involuntary pain response. His belly is rigid, Nora stated calmly. Bored-like, and his heart rate just ticked up to 105. Carter stared at the small, unassuming cut. The knife had gone in at an upward angle. Spleen. It had nicked the spleen or maybe the diaphragm. The kid wasn't bleeding out onto the table. He was quietly bleeding to death into his own abdominal cavity. Panic knocked at the back of Carter's skull. The familiar, paralyzing grip of the unknown threatened to lock his joints. He felt the muscles in his forearms tighten, preparing to shake. He looked at Nora. She wasn't judging him. She was waiting. Just the meat, the mechanics, and the clock. Carter took a deep, jagged breath. He forced the air down into his lungs, grounding himself in the harsh, antiseptic smell of the room. He unclenched his jaw. "Get the portable ultrasound," Carter ordered. His voice didn't crack. "Page the surgical resident on call. Tell them we have a penetrating abdominal trauma, likely splenic rupture, positive peritoneal signs. Start 2 large-bore IVs and hang a liter of warmed fluids. Cross-match for 2 units. Nora moved. She didn't say, "Yes, doctor," or offer a sarcastic salute. She flowed into action, a blur of practiced, hyper-efficient motion. The ultrasound machine was beside the bed in seconds. She slapped a glob of cold blue gel onto the patient's flank and handed Carter the probe. Carter pressed it to the skin. The black and white screen flickered to life. A dark, jagged pool of fluid sat exactly where it shouldn't be. Internal bleeding. A lot of it. "Positive fast exam." Carter confirmed. The trembling in his hands was gone. It was replaced by a cold, functional clarity. "Where is surgery? 5 minutes out," Nora said, taping down the second IV line. "Pressure is dropping, 90/60. He's tanking." "Open the massive transfusion cooler," Carter said, tossing the probe aside. "We push blood now. I need a central line kit. We're going to float a line into his internal jugular before he loses consciousness." Nora ripped the plastic off the kit, slapping it onto the metal stand. "Kit is open. Chloroprep is ready." Carter scrubbed the patient's neck, the sharp, medicinal fumes of alcohol filling his nose. He grabbed the heavy-gauge needle. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look to Nora for confirmation. He found the anatomical landmark, visualized the vein, and pushed the needle through the skin. Dark, venous blood flashed instantly in the syringe barrel. "I'm in," Carter breathed. "Wire." Nora fed the guide wire into the syringe hub, the absolute millisecond he asked for it. Perfect synchronization. The dance. The double doors banged open a moment later, the surgical resident rushing in with 2 scrub nurses. "What do we have? Penetrating trauma left upper quadrant. Splenic rupture. Positive fast. BP is holding at 90 systolic with rapid infusion. Central line is secure." Carter rattled off, smoothly stepping back to give the surgeon's room. "He's all yours." The surgical team swept the patient away in a chaotic flurry of moving wheels, squeaking shoes, and shouted orders. Silence crashed back into Bay 1. Carter stood by the empty bed. He stripped off his bloody gloves, snapping the latex loudly, and tossed them into the red biohazard bin. His pristine scrubs were finally stained with a few dark drops. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but it wasn't the erratic, terrifying beat of panic. It was the steady, powerful rhythm of a job well done. Nora grabbed a bleach wipe from the canister. The familiar, acrid smell quickly erased the iron scent of the room. She began to wipe down the tangled cords of the ultrasound machine. Carter watched her for a moment. He walked over to the supply cart, grabbed his own bleach wipe, and started scrubbing the metal bed rails opposite her. They cleaned in silence. The mechanical hum of the monitors wasn't annoying anymore. It was just background noise. Nora threw her dirty wipe into the trash. She looked across the bed at the young lieutenant. His uniform was rumpled. His perfect hair was a mess. He looked exhausted. He looked finally like a doctor. "Good catch with the rigid abdomen," Carter said quietly, not looking up from the stainless steel rail. "I almost sent him home." "Good stick on the jugular." Nora replied, her voice flat, but the hard edge was gone. "You didn't shake." Carter paused, the bleach wipe heavy in his hand. He looked at the civilian nurse, the Navy captain, the ghost of a world he was only just beginning to understand. He offered a small, exhausted nod. "Thanks, Nora." Nora nodded back. "Anytime, Bradley. Now finish wiping that down. We still have 2 hours left." Did you expect Carter to finally step up, or were you hoping Nora would put him in his place again? That silent respect at the end is what real trauma teams are built on. If this story had your heart racing, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our next gripping medical drama. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.